Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Ashish Singhal. I'm the principal and founder of CanSat Consulting, a quality assurance and regulatory firm specialized in cannabis consulting and food consulting. I will be host for your today's session, and we are excited to welcome you on today's webinar, which is on the topic risk management in cannabis cultivation, tackling hop latent viroid. And this is a growing topic in the cannabis industry because of the widespread issue related to the HLVd viroid. And before we dive in, a few housekeeping notes. Today's session will be approximately 40 to 50 minutes long, where we will be have a 40 minutes of very highly enriched topic discussion on the HLVd, followed by Q&A session. So feel free to drop in your questions in the chat, and we will be answering all of your questions at the end of the presentation. This session is recorded, so anyone who is registered can get a free copy of the presentation after the webinar, or you could also send us an email and we will send you the email details. You can also request the same through the email. So without much further ado, I would like to actually welcome Maria McIntyre, who is the head of safety at bioMérieux, who has an expertise in cannabis microbiology and also diagnostic services. And she is one of the great pioneer in the cannabis microbiology related to the HLVd and one of the few experts in the HLVd stream. So I would like to start now and transfer over to Maria and say a few words before I start the webinar. So Maria, to you.
Good day, Ashish, and everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to connect here today on the important topic of hop latent viroid and understanding it, tackling it, and being able to have greater impacts to the economic situation related to hop latent viroid. We'll get into all of this and more today, but again, such a pleasure to be part of your day in this conversation.
Absolutely. And so, Maria, I think everyone is now worried about in the cannabis cultivation area is that what is HLVd? Because HLVd, to my understanding, is not one of the testing requirement, mandatory testing requirement for any cannabis testing facilities or the cultivation facilities. So, for our audience, can you explain briefly what is HLVd, how it is different from other pathogens, how it spreads, and what are some challenges associated with it? So I know I'm asking a lot, but if you want to just summarize about for someone who doesn't know what is HLVd and how it could impact their cultivation operations.
Sure, and thank you for that. And you're right, there are a lot of other plant pathogens. Hop latent viroid is one of them. And one of the unique elements of hop latent viroid is in its name. It's latent. It can remain dormant, and your plants can be asymptomatic. So when hop latent viroid infects a plant, the full potential of that plant is decreased. That's why it's often referred to as the silent killer of your crop, yields, and profits. So to optimize your operations, naturally you need to understand hop latent viroid and then irradiate it from your facility. It's a very infectious plant pathogen. Again, there's other plant pathogens which we won't get into today, but that silent killer is really impactful. Some of the core may be a little too sciencey for some, but hop latent viroid is a small singular stranded RNA molecule. It's only 256 nucleotides. If we look at SARS-CoV, it's over 29,000 nucleotides. So this little 256 nucleotide can wreak havoc on your operations. So naturally, there's a lot of reasons for you to care about the viroid and how it infects not only your facility, but how to mitigate against that, which I believe we'll talk more about here in a second, Ashish.
Okay, beautiful. And I want to ask now from my perspective, because I also have some microbiology and biotech background, so just my brain is now running in that direction. So there is a bacteria, there is a virus, and this is viroid. So as I understand, as you explained, viroid is a small RNA molecule and all. But for most of these other pathogens, which are of concern, like E. coli, Salmonella, they require surfaces. They could also grow on the surfaces, like they could be the part of the biofilms, or they could impact the yield of the plant also. But why HLVd? How HLVd is now different? Can it grow on the surfaces, or does it has to be require a host like a plant to grow? And is it as pathogenic as E. coli or Salmonella, which is a mandatory testing requirement in most of the states or federally legalized cannabis countries?
Sure. So you're right. Hop latent viroid generally isn't regulated throughout the world, regardless of where regulations are. Um, Predominantly because it's a plant pathogen versus a human pathogen. So naturally it causes destruction to the plant, but not to a consumer if they had hop latent viroid in the product that they were consuming. There's still studies going on to confirm that as the industry continues to emerge, but from the data that I've looked at today, that's not the case. It, certainly, the molecule itself can cause weaker overall plant health, stunted growth, smaller yields, reduced cannabinoid and terpene production, all influencing that crop and that yield and the economic situation connected to the the crop in and of itself. There are some similarities and differences to plant pathogens and human pathogens. Could be a really great conversation for expanding upon in another day, Ashish, because sometimes there are hosts, sometimes it grows on the surface, sometimes it again is in that host as well. And there's some variations even among human pathogens and plant pathogens that we could unpack further.
So I mean, can you give a scale, some sort of a scale, like how widespread the destruction could be if a crop is infected by HLVd, and how prevalent is HLVd at this point of time in cannabis industry? I mean, are there a number of people who are actually impacted by the HLVd, or number of cultivation companies, I meant, or is it still a very new viroid which is just being discovered now?
A combination of many things. Hop latent viroid is not a new viroid per se. The name is indicative of, we find this in hops, as also we find it in other stone fruits. As the cannabis industry emerges, though, there's opportunities for new data sets for specific to cannabis and hemp, and to understand how this viroid further expands within those products. A lot of it's the nature, goes back to the nature of the viroid in and of itself. But there's also certainly opportunities for expansion of data. It's really interesting. You ask about prevalence of hop latent viroid. And from my perspective, I see a lot of great variability and a lot of the factors we'll get into today about prevention, mitigation, and testing techniques to ensure that if you have this, you're controlling it within your environment, are really impactful in that prevalence factor. And getting the information out like we are today here and in other avenues is really important so that others can expand their sanitation and environmental monitoring programs to be able to mitigate against, as well as to save their crop from any harm.
And I think for the audience, I just want to say that we also have a very beautiful presentation made on that, like which includes a lot of those details. And so I think we are going to just share that so you can also get the perspective of some of those numbers, some of those case studies. And Maria, I mean, are you able to share that on your end? Does it allow you?
Sure. So when we talk about prevalence, so switch the narrative a little bit here and see if the screen pops up here. And it's
There you
part of
go.
the reasons, part of the way that I put it into the category, why care? about Hop Latent Viroid in and of itself. This particular data and study was done by Dark Heart Industries out of California because they realized early on Hop Latent Viroid can cause great devastation to the cannabis plants, and it has direct correlation to yields and profitability. And if you can see here, just using the numbers from the study, average of 3 pounds, it's in US dollars. For 2,000 pounds, you have a plant harvest is about 6,000 US dollars. So if your hop latent is infecting your crop and it's a yield reduction of 70%, then it's a loss of 4,000 per plant. And then naturally, depending on how many plants you have infected, this number will change. And so this is something we anchor on in many conversations throughout the industry, the study by Dark Heart Industries, and the financial impact that can have. And naturally, that impacts a smaller cultivation versus a large cultivation differently. However, it's still a huge impact regardless of where you are on the scope of operational size.
I completely agree. And by looking at these numbers, if you think about $4 million per thousand infected plants is quite a bit. And if we talk about some large scale MSOs, they could have 100,000 plants and impacting of, so if the HLVd is so widespread, that could have a detrimental impact on the cannabis facilities. And an interesting thing I want to also say is quite a few of our clients are on the exporting side of the cannabis. And what we are seeing is that first conversation which we happen with the importing partners is they're not so worried about E. coli salmonella because that is something is a part of the testing requirements, but they're worried about HLVd because HLVd is something is not part of the testing requirement. So it now comes up during the audit. Like during the audit is one of the check is that whether you what steps you are making to prevent HLVd or to make sure that you do not have HLVd because no one is testing. And if you're not testing, if you're not checking, how would you know if your plants are affected HLVd and what could also be the impact on the consumer health and safety for something which is not tested like pesticides, E. coli, or salmonella. So I think maybe in near future, who knows that the government might bring up a mandated testing on HLVd, or if not the government, then the importing partners are just going to become more and more cautious to be making sure that they do not end up importing HLVd contaminated product. So very interesting. Thanks for sharing that insight, Maria. And I think my next question now comes to it is, we have talked a lot about what is HLVd, how widespread this could have an impact on the cannabis cultivation. I think the next question comes to is, what are some of the diagnostic tools or strategies which are available to detect the HLVd? And I will just throw another sub question there. At what stage or at what point it is recommended to test HLVd? Is it during the cloning stage, during the mother stage, during the veg stage, or it does not impact in which stage you test for it?
Sure, thank you for that. To get to the answer of the questions there, I think it's impactful first to address how it's spread. Hop latent viroid is very unique in that it's an opportunist like many organisms, and it can spread through many of these areas: contaminated tools, hands, workers. We see a lot of this from cross-contamination from indoor warehouse grows from one side of the building to another. So we'll get into mitigation here in a minute, but it's important to know that human contamination and that cross-contamination are factors in this, as well as, Ashish, you mentioned the infected mothers and clones and cuttings and stock plants, as well as tissue culture media and seeds as well. can help create that spread. We are seeing some studies that demonstrate us to believe that water and contaminated surfaces have an impact. And then when we shift outdoor, naturally, the environment's drastically different when rain, wind, and proximity come into play there as well. So those are important to understand as we get into diagnostic tools. First, you mentioned the dynamic of when to test. There's numerous philosophies on where to test and where to test on the plant and when to test. We have found that through various studies that the root material and the young leaf material are the predominant areas of focus. Naturally, you can test both simultaneously. In this picture here of a method by bioMérieux for testing, it shows an example of a leaf, but commonly the leaf and the roots are more of the focus for testing. And there are numerous diagnostic solutions on the market. This is one of them. As you're looking at diagnostic solutions, you're looking in that early cultivation time frame. You also, when you look for a solution, you want something that's easy to deploy. And so this is just one example of something that's easy. It's just a few steps and transfer steps. And then it is a PCR. So it is looking at the genetics of the organism itself. So if the reaction is there for the genetics of Hop Latent Viroid, you'll get a positive, and then that will give you more information to understand how to navigate your crop and cultivation.
Understandable.
So it's
and
good.
Thanks. Yeah, sorry, keep going.
Pardon. Just to piggyback on that a little bit, it's good to have a diagnostic strategy, regardless of what method you're using. That PCR for testing is essential. Again, it's looking at the DNA and ensuring that on the basic fundamental DNA level that the organism is there. We do have groups that have part of their diagnostic strategy. They have initial screenings of incoming plants, incoming materials, just really to understand what they're bringing into their site to ward off any challenges. And then from there, the ongoing monitoring to implement regular testing over regular intervals in those early stages to prevent or decrease the contamination spread.
Awesome. Beautiful. I think this gives a very good understanding of the diagnostic, and thank you for sharing, Maria, because I think what is important for everyone to understand is how diagnostic work or what techniques are being used is because what technique you are utilizing. For instance, if someone is utilizing PCR technique or qPCR, or if someone is utilizing, I'm talking in terms of microbiology, if they're using plating technique for their microbial analysis compared to PCR, the results will change widely. And this is something we have seen in the microbial analysis for not pathogens, but more or less total aerobic count, total yeast and mold count, where some labs does utilize qPCR versus a plating method because qPCR is much faster. However, if you think about the reliability of the results, obviously the plating method will be much more reliable. So I think from a cultivation point, it is important for any organization to understand a bit about how the pathogen is actually identified or tested, and making sure if they're testing through the lab or any other testing methodology utilized even in-house, that their methods are completely validated and checked before they actually test for it. So I think this is also very important to understand, and I think would want you to add on that. Now, my next question, I think it comes
Just to add on
sure.
that, if you don't mind, Ashish.
100%.
Thanks. To add on that, DNA is the fundamental building blocks for each of us, for plants, for existence. So when you can deploy a method that looks at those fundamentals and looks at those characteristics, you're going to have robustness, reliability, reproducibility in that data.
Exactly, exactly. And then I think when we talk about something like viroid, which is an RNA molecule, you need to have to rely on polymerase chain reaction and these kind of technologies, which are going to be super accurate, and they cannot detect something different because it's just directly related to the RNA DNA combination. So absolutely agree on that. And I think, Maria, now my next question comes to it, which is also a little bit of my expertise is what are some of the prevention measures which could be taken to prevent HLVd at first itself? And I do understand that it is acting as the HLVd is similar in the case of a bacteria or any other virus. We want to employ some prevention techniques. So would be more interested to know from your perspective, what are some tools or techniques the companies could use as part of their SOP management or as part of their IPM program, whatever it is, what they can use to make sure that they do not have this in their facility.
Sure. So we've touched on a little bit on how this is spread, and I'm sure the team online here today can think of already some ideas on mitigation and strategies connected to it. So here are some common things from a visual standpoint in preventing and managing plant pathogens, specifically around hop latent viroid, is to focus on these areas. Of course, we mentioned before incoming materials, the mother room, the propagation, the media, as well as the trimming and the tools connected for sanitation, and that overall cleaning of the from an indoor perspective of your cultivation room. It's also important for your pest management control. There's studies that maybe the jury's still out on the potential of some of the beneficial insects carrying this viroid from plant to plant. It's something that's still under investigation, but to understand your program and have plant pathogens specifically around the hop latent viroid connected to your pest management control is really impactful. If we dive in a little bit deeper here, there's cultivation conditions that for both pre-harvest and post-harvest that can certainly help mitigate the situation. So certainly biological controls are one of them, removing diseased cuttings, quarantining infected plants. For this dynamic, I've seen groups quarantine in the same area, but just off in a corner, or there's groups that have quarantine rooms where that plant is protected and then relocated to more of an official quarantine room that then decreases the risk even further of that cultivation room being contaminated, since the plants may be off in the corner and other facilities. Pre-harvest, avoid injuries to roots. We'll get into this a little bit more maybe in a minute, but when we have an injury, when we're stressed, we are more prone to capturing an illness. It's no different with plants. So as you're working through pre-harvest, ensure that you're not disturbing the roots is very critical. We've talked about the mother plants and the offsprings. By testing, you can confirm that they are disease-free. There's a lot of work being done on that last topic here in pre-harvest in growing strains that are tolerant of the infection. There's a lot of research, again, on determining those strains and then deploying those into operations. It's a technique of prevention that's very helpful. Also, it's very cost prohibitive to many groups. When we take prevention techniques to the other side of the harvest to post-harvest, the humidity, temperature, circulation, and timing all play strongly into this. Again, if At post-harvest, the plant is dead, really. We've trimmed it and it's dying, and it's more susceptible to diseases regardless of viroids, viruses, microbiologics in this area. So controlling the environment around humidity, timing, circulation, and the others you see there is really critical so that you're not inducing environmental stresses into the situation.
Thank you, Maria. That was very, very deep. I mean, and you covered a lot of good points around the environmental controls and sanitation practices. And I would just like to add a couple of things here. And what we have seen also working with the cannabis cultivation facilities is sometimes the most simplest thing is overlooked, and which is personal protective equipment. So what we have to make sure is, and one of the best strategy to prevent any of the viruses, bacteria, and especially something like HLVd, is not to take shortcuts in wearing proper personal protective equipment. And that mean is that you do not need to be going into the facility wearing shorts or wearing just the top lap coat, but no full length coverall. Because what will happen is someone who's coming into the facility, you do not know if your employees are coming directly from a nursery. Maybe they have their own garden. Maybe they already have their small cannabis operation on the side. They're growing few plants and they're directly coming for the cultivation. And if they come and they just do not change into their full PPE, there's a risk we are introducing in bringing HLVd and also any other potential pathogens. The another good point which Maria brought forward is the biologicals. Now, beneficial organism or biologicals are being used widespread. They're super expensive compared to pesticides, but they are being utilized because of also the benefit not to use chemicals. However, they are also not vetted properly. The reason is, I mean, if you call a vendor and ask them, can you provide a certificate of analysis? And they will say, how I'm going to provide that. I cannot test a ladybug or some sort of beneficial organism. So how you're going to make sure that the beneficial organisms you're getting from a facility is actually properly, if not tested, there is some sort of assurance that that beneficial organism is not carrying HLVd or not carrying any other pathogen. So in that case, you need to develop strong systems in place. And that's basically comes with your writing your SOPs, which are built around prevention rather than the reactive approach. So if you're building your SOPs where you are including strategies to prevent HLVd management, to make sure that you're getting the non-cannabis supplies, which includes your, for instance, fertilizer, pesticides, and especially like biological controls, they are coming from reputed organization. They're coming from a company who has been in business for some time. At least request for a letter of guarantee, because all of these things actually gives you a little bit more assurance where you are getting your inputs from and prevents you further from the risk. The other thing is the water, which Maria also touched base. Make sure you're testing your water frequently. And I've never seen in my career that someone is testing water for HLVd. Though there is a less risk of transfer of HLVd through water, because obviously it cannot grow in water, at least to what I'm aware about. But still, it is important to make sure that your water is coming from a reputed source. If you have a private well water, if it's not coming from the city or municipality, make sure you're testing it more often to be preventing any of the other pathogens. I would also want to add another thing is if you get HLVd or already in your facility and you're not aware about that, and that could happen, like maybe your plants are already stressed out and you think maybe it's powdery mildew, it's thrips or something else, but you don't know it's HLVd yet. So in these kind of early signs, you have to make sure that you are employing proper sanitation practices. What does it mean is if you're doing a harvest, it takes 10 seconds. Make sure that you are sanitizing your tools in between each plant. Do not wait to sanitize your tool for the whole crop, because now if certain part of your crop is infected, you have infected the whole crop. So these small steps, like sanitizing your tools between each plant, will actually help you stop the spread of HLVd contamination. So build your strategies, build your systems, including your writing of your SOPs as a prevention strategy for HLVd, and that will pay you in long run, and that will save you a lot of cost. So thank you very much, Maria, for bringing such an important point, all the important points there. And I think my next question is now coming to what
Sure, Ashish. And
compli
then
Sure.
just to summarize what you indicated around SOPs and that prevention side of things,
Yeah,
these four best practices really come into play as a visual for the group here today. The sanitation practices, knowing your environments, testing, and that overall being proactive and having it written into your SOPs are critical to uh, mitigate and manage the Hop Latent Viroid.
I think we should just give it a quick second. I don't think it shared the content. Can you share that one more time? I think it was just loading. It was
Certainly.
taking some time. Yeah, no issues. There you go. There
Thank
you
you for
go.
letting me
Beautiful.
know.
No issues. Yeah, so we see some of these strategies here. Nice. Okay. Know your environment,
So
sanitation.
yeah, we'll leave it up there for a second, but
Sure.
we touched on these points as well as others, and the importance, of course, of having it in your SOPs, your standard operating procedures to ensure, and also going back and looking at those standard operating procedures as things change in your cultivation and in your business to make sure that what you're doing is what your operating procedures reflect.
Awesome. No, thanks a lot, Maria. This is really helpful, and I think it does give a very broad understanding about the HLVd prevention techniques. My next question would be that leaning into some of the case studies, where do you think, like are there some studies which are already done or taken from some of the case examples where HLVd issues has been seen or some implementation strategies has been implemented? Maybe if you can share some of those, and if you want to touch base on the same with the group.
Sure, there's quite a few. So it's really to come to a conversation like this to give resources, you have to trim it down a lot. And so these four that are outlined here are not exclusive studies and research insights. They're just four that we decided to highlight today. And dark heart industries comes up again as in the United States, Hop Latent Viroid was seen first in California, potentially for many reasons. It lent opportunities to the skill sets and work at Dark Heart Industries, and they've identified Hop Latent Viroid in 90% of cultivation sites. They've discovered and highlighted the impact of Hop Latent Viroid throughout cultivation. We looked at the numbers earlier on the potential plant loss and cultivation loss for growers. It's all based on US numbers, but we can extrapolate that further by the prevalence factor of Hop Latent Viroid. And as you have access to this presentation, there's some links not only for Dark Heart, but for the other groups that are noted here on their work and more details on what that work looked like if you wish to go into that even further. On the second one there, to highlight that one a little more with narrative, Safari Flower in Canada, they've done a lot of work around micropropagation and tissue culture. Certainly in my opinion, an expensive route to go, but certainly an important route to go as you're cloning plants to ensure that they're Hop Latent Viroid free from any infections. And we've seen a lot of groups move to tissue culture because of this and the opportunity to, in essence, control the outcomes and not to rely on potentially the variability of seeds. Seeds still certainly have a good place in the industry, but they're they're harder to test because you have to destroy them to test them, and that adds to another dynamic of the situation. So the tissue culture processing time is a little lengthy, but again, it offers opportunities for looking at genetics, looking for the viroid and eliminating it when it's there.
Absolutely. And I think thanks for touching base on the point, but I want to come back to one good point here is tissue culture. So when actually cannabis got legalized in Canada, tissue culture was very predominant. Like everyone wanted to do the tissue culture and they wanted to save their genetics. However, as you mentioned, Maria, then they realized that it's so expensive because not the companies were pre-revenue and they wanted to do the tissue culture, but they cannot do the tissue culture. They cannot sustain it. Even if they did the initially, they cannot keep changing the medium, bringing the expert, or have a proper designated tissue culture lab, or they had the contamination issues because they did not have a proper laminar flow or the hood to do the tissue culture techniques. So basically, but what I think in my suggestion could be done at least is that companies could spend and at least have tissue culture done on their mother plants. So at least they have the genetics saved like in a bank. And then when you have that genetics saved in a bank, at least if you have some of a very bigger concern of a widespread cultivation issues related to HLVd, and let's assume the worst case scenario, your crop is wiped out, at least your mother plants are saved. You have your stock because you don't want to be in a situation where even your mother plants are infected with HLVd and you're killing everything, and then you have to restart with the whole thing of bringing your mother plants. So that is also a part of a strategy, in my view, the companies could implement at least to make sure that if they can, if they have the capacity in terms of resources, to at least look into the mother plants from the tissue culture point. Another thing I would say is one point you brought it forward is uh, like the testing lab is tested, and there were about 33% of the samples which was tested for HLVd. To me, that itself tells me that this is more of a hidden problem and which is coming into surface right now. Because for someone to be found about 33% of the samples contaminated with HLVd is a significant problem. And now we're just started to testing or realizing it. Now it is becoming of a bigger issue and coming into play. So I think it has become more important now than ever to include the HLVd detection or to make sure that at least there are prevention strategies so not to prevent HLVd. And one more point I would just throw in is when you if you are a company who is buying clones from another company and you're directly using the clones to cultivate rather than doing in-house propagation, you have to absolutely make sure do not just buy the clones without any HLVd testing because you do not want to be wait for months to grow the plants, harvest and everything, and then to find out that you have HLVd issues where your guarantees are gone. You cannot send those product back, obviously. You cannot get any refund as part of a quality agreement. So make sure when you are buying clones from a company, you're doing your due diligence, make sure you have a strong vendor qualification and a vendor assessment program. You're vetting your nurseries or the cannabis companies properly before you get the plants in your facility. That will save the companies a lot of cost in the long run. So
Ashish, you
yeah.
bring up a really good point there, that this Hop Latent Viroid isn't a common test or as routine as it really, in our perspectives, needs to be to ensure the quality and safety and economics of the cultivation. I think we can really lean into looking at the food industry here from the other side of things. The food we consume is all tested before it goes to market. And because when we go to the grocery store and buy that product, we aren't questioning or concerned about if testing was done. It was done in some capacity based on various criteria. We're on the opposite side of the fence here in the cannabis industry with Hop Latent Viroid. If you need that information, you have to ask, and in some cases, you have to advocate for really getting that. And we've seen a lot of change in dynamics of that within the cannabis industry over the years, and having it have such an impact in ensuring that quality and safe plant coming into your facility and the residual effects downstream.
Absolutely. And thanks for bringing those points up. And I think in lieu of the time, I'm just going to have one more question come up with, which is how can cultivators stay ahead of emerging threats like HLVd? And maybe if you also want to expand not just on HLVd, but also probably if you have time, like wild tolerant gram-negative bacteria, because that is certainly, we are also seeing a lot of contamination around BTG and bacteria contamination, and which is also a required testing. So how can cultivators stay ahead of the HLVd issue in general? What they can do if they want to start something now today, what they can do?
Sure, and that as the slide opens up here, to stay ahead of emerging threats from plant pathogens, and including Hop Latent Viroid, to broaden the lens, cannabis cultivators need to adopt proactive multi-layered approaches that combine early detection, rigorous sanitation, genetic screening, and ongoing education. And the ongoing education is really important. As we all know, cannabis is a continued emerging industry throughout the world, and that data continues to expand. So continuing to lean in on that and adjusting forward is essential, as well as regular testing of the mother plants and clones using the sensitive molecular diagnostics, such as the PCR methods we talked about. It's essential for catching the viroid before symptoms appear, and also implementing strict hygiene protocols, such as disinfecting tools, wearing gloves, isolating new or symptomatic plants can significantly reduce the overall spread. Also maintaining a clean and well-monitored environment with good airflow and minimum stress on the plants helps reduce susceptibility to infections. And again, staying informed with webinars such as this, industry networks, scientific publications, and opportunities to collaborate with plant pathologists enables growers in the industry to quickly adapt to new threats and invest in disease-resistant genetics, like Ashish mentioned, where available, can further fortify operations against further outbreaks. So you can see what I said there in really some big summary buckets of being proactive, strict hygiene procedures, multi-layered approach, staying informed, and then data integration, all important in staying ahead of emerging threats for plant pathogens. When it comes to biological organisms, a lot of this has to play as well. If there's interest, Ashish, with you and your team in the industry, I'm more than willing to have that narrative specifically to biotolerant gram-negative, and perhaps even adding yeasts and molds or specific fungi to the conversation. It could be impactful.
Sounds good. Okay. No, I think what when you have this, I love this, first of all, the graph, like how it's going and showing all of those rings and important elements. And I think to summarize from my end, I would say that all the points, although Maria, you have already taken care of. And I think, but some of the key thing I would say for any producer is do not leave the basics. The basics are still going to help you a lot in prevention of these strategies, prevention of HLVd for sure. And the basics are aligning your PPE, aligning your safety and hygiene practices, as Maria has outlined. And in fact, not just limiting to your employees. You could have a visitor, you could have an electrician fixing something. And if you do not have a PPE or the hygiene procedure for your electrician or a plumber or anyone who is going inside your plants containing room, that you're still putting the same risk as compared as for your employees. So make sure that you have robust procedures, and all of these procedures are written properly. They're not like you cannot write a vague document and make and expect for your employees or workers that they will understand and they will follow all those procedures. So implement something, enforce something, and then train them and then reevaluate. So follow these strategies. And it is also important to regularly scout. And I know that I'm not the cultivation expert, but scouting is not a mandatory thing. Like no one is going to ask you how often you're scouting. But if you scout your plants every week and document and generate the data, as Maria mentioned, like generate how many plants are impacted with what, and trend that data, and then you will always able to see that and are able to identify some key pinching points. Maybe during this particular season you had high level of contamination. Maybe you see HLVd spread to a particular strain, but the other strain is immune to it. So all of that data analysis is also going to help you in determining how to selectively utilize the prevention strategies. So with that being said, I think this is the completion of the webinar. And now we will see if we have any questions. We have a question. So Maria, is if HLVd is such a big threat, why this is not part of mandatory testing requirement by state and federal authorities where applicable? It's a good question, actually.
It's a very good question, and I feel like the answer is fact and opinion based. As we know, the regulations across uh, the various countries in the world do not have hop latent viroid and generally don't have plant pathogens. The focus has been on the risk to health and consumer safety when we look at those regulations. We certainly have opportunities as an industry to be a voice when regulations are being written or rewritten to participate in those open comments and indicate the needs that are there expanded beyond or connecting to science. In many cases, regulations may be written by scientists, and in other cases, they are not. So again, that education piece is certainly huge for us. So in my personal opinion, and a passion point, both plant health and human health. But the human health side has been the focus to ensure that in this industry that is subject to some types of scrutiny at times, that we ensure that people aren't getting sick. That's certainly a huge important factor to this narrative, but also as the question lends itself to indicate, there's also the need to consider plant health in a stronger element than it currently is in regulations. So again, I'd urge you to participate in those open comments or regulatory sessions, or feel free to reach out to myself or Ashish, or we can also recommend other key opinion leaders in the industry to help those guideposts be driven forward.
Yeah, and I think coming to the next question, it's kind of similar, and I think this I can expand on too, is that how big of this is a threat for exporting markets for cannabis, especially in Germany and Australia, that is part of a mandatory. I think what it's supposed to say, that is not part of mandatory testing. So the HLVd is not part of mandatory testing. So I mean, and to add my point on that part, it's similar to what Maria has already mentioned, is exporting. If you're an exporter and there is an importer in Germany and Australia, what you will find is that there is a set of specifications which you have to follow, and but at the same time you have to have a proper conversation with your supplier, and you have to have a proper buyer agreement, supplier agreement, and the most important piece is a quality agreement. Quality agreement is where you have the responsibilities outlined, and the responsibilities of the QA or the compliance of one company and compared to the other company, who's taking what responsibility. Now, some of these mandatory testing are not part of the specifications, but they could ask you, or they could mention in the quality agreement, if we found any other pathogen, and they might not specify whether it's E. coli, Salmonella, or as part of your specification, but any pathogen or any issues with your product, then they could reject the shipment. So this is where This is where you have to be careful when you're dealing not just export market, but also in the domestic, that you have a robust quality agreement. And to come to the question, why it is not part of the mandatory testing, again, it's the same thing which Maria has explained is similar to say why powdery mildew is not part of the testing, but why it's just total yeast and mold count, why thrips is not part of the testing, why certain diseases or botrytis or etc. are not part of the testing. So the answer is same. Similarly, HLVd is not part of the testing because no one has identified or no one has understood maybe there could be an impact on the safety of the consumer, health and safety of the consumer. If you have a high cadmium level, you immediately see an impact on the human health and safety. But if you have an HLVd detection, can we identify an immediate impact on the health and safety of consumer? At this point, maybe not. So all of these cannabis regulations are written from the point of, is there any negative impact on the health and safety of consumer? They're not written from high THC, low THC, and all that information. They are written from the safety point. So I think, as Mary has mentioned, it is more of a policy change. It is an evolving area in cannabis. If there are more voices going to be come up where people will say, well, I will not consume a cannabis because HLVd could impact me, maybe the policy change will come. So I think that's where I will keep it. Um, we have time to take one or two more. How big of this is a threat for cannabis export markets for cannabis, especially in Germany and Australia? I think this is already covered. So uh, is HL if HLVd is such a big threat, that is already covered. So then I think this is what I'm going to take. Why is it important to test mother plants for HLVd regularly? I think this is a good one. So I will get it to you, Maria. So the question is why HLVd testing for mother plants is important and why it should be tested regularly.
Sure. So the mother plant is the main source of where clones are coming from. And so if you start with something that you know is cleaned from Hop Latent Viroid or other plant pathogens, that is your baseline for everything else that is propagated from that mother. And every generation there is to be a replicate of that mother. And you want to replicate that good DNA, that clean plant, the Hop Latent Viroid free, so that all of your generations to follow are replicates of that good foundation.
Yeah, and I think just to expand on that, and this is a simple but important question. The reason is you're going to propagate clones from your mother plants. So you have an option either to test your clones with each batch, or probably you can set up a technique of testing your mother plants periodically. So depending on how much you are cloning, like if you're cloning from your mother plants every month, then obviously it makes sense to save some on the testing costs and maybe test your mother plants quarterly. And this is just general advice. Obviously, any of the one who's listening, they have to implement based on their operations. But let's say if you are testing if you are cloning only once every 3 months or 4 months, it makes sense to test your clone batch for the HLVd. But the testing of the mother plants in general, as Mary has mentioned, is important because from the stock point, your mother plant is like your preserved jewel. You want to make sure that your mother plant doesn't get affected because if your stock is getting affected, it's very difficult to obviously grow that mother plant. Maybe you do not have the seeds to grow those mother plants. And so that's where I think the tissue culture could come into play is maybe have just your mother plants have tissue culture and save it in like a proper safe place. So at least you have your stock there, even if something happens. But yeah, testing of mother plants is very important regularly. So at least you are prevented from the HLVd. So Maria, any last comments you have? Uh, I will leave it to you.
Yeah, thank you. It's just been a great conversation here today. And like with any topics, when it comes to plant pathogens or human pathogens, it's really the tip of the iceberg of where we can go and what needs to be discussed and amplified. As we close up today, appreciate everybody's time And also, please feel free to contact me through the information provided by Ashish and CanSat Consulting to be able to continue the conversations and help you in your journey around hop latent viroid or other plant or human pathogens.
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Maria. Actually, it was a very interesting webinar to do with you and a very emerging topic, HLVd. All I hear is about from importers is also concerned around HLVd. And thank you for your insight, your presentation that was done. It was very detailed and it was very interesting to talk about to you. Also try to brush up my biotech side of the things a bit from years back. Really appreciate of you joining and for everyone on the audience side and whoever is going to listen to this webinar later, if you would like to request the presentation slides, there is an email address in the last slide, info@CanSat Consulting, or you can reach out to me, asinghal@CanSat. It says in the presentation in the last slide. You can reach out to us and we can send it to you, the presentation slides, with no cost associated. It's just for the information point of view. And thanks everyone for joining, and thank you, Maria, once again. We look forward to do more webinars with you in the future.
Likewise, thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.